Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Greenbank's 26th Annual Investor Day. Greenbank is the specialist ethical, sustainable, and impact ESI division of the Rathbones Group. It was established in 2004, and happily, many of that original team still work for Greenbank today. Why? Because we hold a strong belief in the importance of investing in line with our clients' values and in a way that is good for both people and our planet. This inspires their loyalty and indeed our own. As the chair of the Rathbones Group, I am immensely proud to welcome you to the 26th Greenbank Investor Day. That's not a bad record in itself. We started in 1999, and this exemplifies Greenbank's long history of being in the vanguard of ESI investment. And importantly, throughout this time, our Greenbank team has engaged in open and constructive dialogue on different environmental and social issues with investee companies to positively influence them and encourage a transformation to a more sustainable world. Our first Greenbank Investor Day was held in Bristol and focused on the theme of water management. And here are a few statistics to stir your memory. In 1999, we were all worried about Y2K and how would our computers deal with the new millennium? How would our clocks recognize the year 2000? The human population then was 6 billion, and now it's nearly 8 billion. The euro as a currency had just been introduced, and regrettably, another European war in Yugoslavia had just started. So how did we think about climate in 1999? Then climate change could be described or viewed as serious but not urgent. The Kyoto protocols on emissions reductions had been agreed in 1997, but there was still widespread public skepticism and a suspicion of the client scientists. Thankfully, and of necessity, the world has changed substantially. Likewise, our investment industry has evolved in parallel. The concepts of ethical and sustainable investing are and is universally recognized. And again, in parallel, regulation is increasingly challenging cynical aspects such as greenwashing. Investors and corporates now face greater pressures to manage and report on their social and environmental footprints. In Rathbones, we welcome these changes in the regulatory landscape and are confident that with our long establishments and in ethical and sustainable investments, that we are engineered to prevent greenwashing. We feel that your ethical investment objectives will be fulfilled by us. Rathbones as a business, and Greenbank in particular, continues to grow. We grow our teams, we grow the business, and most importantly, we grow our client propositions. In April this year, the Rathbones Group announced our planned combination with Investec Wealth, and we are delighted at the prospect of working with our new colleague in this area going forward. But back to today's proceedings. The theme for this year's events is Unlocking a Net Zero Future. We hear so much about the transition to net zero, and today we will look at the thread that will bind and underpin a transition in our energy systems. The thread that is key to ensuring we move towards a less carbon-intensive future and one which will create systemic change through innovations in technology. The team has curated an excellent lineup of speakers to help us navigate the subject. I know you'll find today's discussion both informative and thought-provoking, and I'm sure that you'll have plenty of difficult questions for our panels after their presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to John David, Head of Greenbank, who will guide us through what to expect from today's events. David.
Thank you very much indeed, Clive. And speaking on behalf of the Greenbank team, I'm delighted to introduce this, our 26th Investor Day. At Greenbank, as Clive has said, we are proud of our heritage, and our commitment to sustainable investment is evidenced by the long history of Investor Days such as this one today. Over the past 20 years, Greenbank has gone from strength to strength, with more than 2 billion in assets under management for private clients, charities, and trusts. Our recently expanded team of over 60 sits across Rathbones offices in London, Bristol, Liverpool, and Edinburgh, and includes specialist investment managers, sustainability researchers, financial analysts, as well as a wonderful supporting team. Since our beginnings, our aim has been to empower our clients to invest their money as a force for good, together championing the transition to a healthier planet and a more equitable society, whilst, of course, ensuring that our clients' financial goals are met. This is more than just a profession for the Greenbank team. It is our passion. We share our clients' commitment to see investment capital as a driver of positive change in a world facing a broad range of challenges, reflected through the 8 sustainable investment themes that underpin our portfolios. It is too easy to focus on the present at the expense of the future. And whilst there are clearly huge immediate issues for the world to face, such as dealing with the economic aftermath of a pandemic and the ongoing Ukraine conflict, it is sobering to reflect that 7 of the World Economic Forum's top 10 10-year risks are climate change related. And this is why we have chosen today's theme, Unlocking a Net Zero Future. Climate change poses an existential threat to society and the planet on which we depend, and therefore to its economy, its financial system, and its investment markets. Our aim today is to shine a light on the wide-ranging activity being undertaken to drive technological innovation in our energy system to help meet this challenge head-on. We are not here to say that all is in hand, but rather to say that solutions are being found, and if delivered at scale, will help us address the climate crisis. We will hear today from 3 external speakers representing companies working to lead the transition to net zero, companies who are leading in innovation and technology and investing in the net zero journey. And alongside our guest speakers, our head of ESI research, Kate Elliot, and Kai Johns, ESI researcher, will explain how net zero and climate is one of Greenbank's key engagement themes, sitting not just at the heart of our investment process, but also our stewardship activity. Before we welcome Kate as our chair, I'll do some quick IT housekeeping and run through today's agenda. So IT first, you can submit a question at any time through the engagement panel with the scrolling bar on the right of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time permits during the Q&A, and you are welcome to post your question anonymously. Throughout the presentations, the speakers may instigate a poll. This will also pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. Do please answer the questions as they arise. You will also see that we have Greenbank publications to download from the engagement panel. Please do tweet about the event using hashtag InvestorDay2023, 2023 in numbers, and tag us at GreenbankInvest so that we can see your post. If you do lose connection, then please try and rejoin through the event link. And if you are having any issues using the conference portal, then click the head mic icon at the top right corner of your screen, also available on the engagement panel under Stream Assistance. Now to the agenda, which you can see on your screens. Kate will start the sessions with an introduction to net zero, where we currently stand in the transition, and what this means in an investment context. We will then hear from our speakers, Catherine Raw, MD of SSE Thermal, David Bryon, CFO of First Light Fusion, John Flaherty, MD of Gridsdale Energy Storage of SMS PLC, and finally Kai Johns from the Greenbank home team. There will be a short break halfway through, and our event will conclude with a panel discussion. But I'll now hand the baton over to Kate, and I hope you all enjoy this day. Thank you.
Afternoon all, and a pleasure to be presenting to you today. I wanted to provide a little bit of scene setting and outline the challenges that climate change presents before we hear from our other speakers on potential solutions to that challenge. But before I begin, and to make sure you're all paying attention, the first of our poll questions, which should hopefully be visible on the screen now, and that is, what proportion of the emissions cuts needed for the UK to remain on track for its net zero ambitions are currently backed by credible policies? So you've got the voting ranges there, and you should have the option, as John said, via the engagement panel to submit your answers. And we're going to come back to that point later. But before then, I want to go right back to basics and consider the issue of what net zero emissions actually means. So this graphic here, so it shows a stylized net zero pathway. It's not based on any particular scenario or model, but what we see is time being measured along the x-axis, moving from the current day to an arbitrary point in the future. And on the y-axis, we see the volume of greenhouse gases being added or removed from the atmosphere. The solid red section shows greenhouse gases being emitted, and the solid green section shows those being removed, either through measures such as carbon capture and storage, or nature-based solutions such as reforestation or the restoration of peatlands. It's the dotted black line running through the middle that shows the net position, so greenhouse gases emitted, less those being removed. And it's here where you can see the little arrow pointing, where that line crosses the x-axis, that we reach net zeros and indeed move to a period of negative emissions. And a couple of things on this I want to mention. So firstly, this chart could be equally applicable to a country, to an industry, or indeed an individual company. Though of course the starting values and the speed of decarbonisation will vary as soon as you start to plug in real world data. And the second important thing to note is that reaching net zero clearly requires a combination of reducing emissions and removing carbon from the atmosphere. And that's because there will always be some degree of emissions that are impossible or extremely difficult or costly to avoid. But what we don't want to see is that red section above the line remaining static and everything resting on emissions removal to get to that net zero point. What we look for in companies is that they are doing everything that they possibly can to reduce emissions first, before they turn to offsets or removals. And that's a concept called the mitigation hierarchy. That clearly makes financial sense because negative emissions technologies are costly. Many of them still remain technologically unproven. But it also makes sense from a kind of common sense point of view. After all, if your house is overly warm, you'd first look to turn off the heating before you start investing in aircon. So that's net zero at a conceptual level, but what does it mean when we think about an investment portfolio? So here, there's two important measures that we look to track progress. Firstly, we have a top-down measure of the carbon intensity of an investment portfolio, and that's often measured in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per £1 million invested. There's a number of different ways that you can calculate that figure, but in essence, it looks at the underlying carbon intensity of everything that is invested in, and then aggregates that up to a portfolio level. You can then map that portfolio figure against the market as a whole and against a given decarbonisation pathway to understand how much work needs to be done to meet a net zero goal. And the second measure we look at is what we call a bottom-up target, and that looks at each individual investment held within a portfolio and assesses whether or not they are aligned to net zero. And you can see an illustration here where each dot at the bottom of the slide represents a portfolio holding. The empty red dots are investments that are not aligned to a net zero pathway, and the solid green ones are aligned. And then we see over time, in order to meet a net zero target, at a portfolio level, we need to see the top-down emissions reducing and the bottom-up net zero coverage increasing until we reach a point where we have 100% of underlying holdings aligned to net zero. And that's what Greenbank is seeking to do and seeking to achieve under our 2040 net zero target. We're targeting investment in companies that are on a low carbon pathway, and we're using our engagement to hold companies to account and to push positive change on behalf of our clients. But back to the question at hand and the question of decarbonising our energy system. And today we're going to have a particular focus on the UK climate ambitions and the role of the energy system in helping to meet them. In 2019, the UK committed to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the UK also uses a system of carbon budgets that were introduced through the 2008 Climate Change Act. Now, these provide 5-year statutory caps on greenhouse gas emissions the total of those emissions that can be emitted during that period, with the cap reducing in each 5-year period in line with the overall climate ambition. There have been 6 budgets set so far, taking us from 2008 through to 2037. And this chart here shows an assessment by the Climate Change Committee of the policy gap between ambition and action for the UK's 6th carbon budget. The dotted line at the top shows business as usual emissions, and the solid line trending downwards shows the pathway set out as part of our net zero goals. And then the coloured segments in between the two show an assessment by the Climate Change Committee of how certain those emissions reductions are based on current policy. So now returning to that question that I posed at the beginning, and I can see the results coming in now, you're actually kind of on a whole more pessimistic than reality would suggest on the outlook for UK climate policy, because the correct answer based on the Climate Change Committee's assessment is that credible funded plans with timelines in place exist for 39% of the required emissions cuts through to 2037. A further 24% have some risks attached, so those tend to be kind of well-developed policy areas, but perhaps with question marks over the implementation or the timescales. 33% of the emissions cuts needed have significant policy risks, where plans are still very much under development. And I think perhaps most worryingly of all, 5% of emissions cuts are assessed as having non-existent or clearly inadequate plans in place to deliver them. Now, should note that that assessment was conducted in 2022. We're due an updated progress report from the Climate Change Committee imminently, and I did check this morning to see if it had been published, but nothing out yet. And that will take account of more recent policy announcements that have been made in the interim. Also important to note that that assessment predates a landmark High Court ruling in July last year that found the UK's net zero strategy actually breached the statutory obligations set out under the Climate Change Act. So what has changed since last year? Well, March 2023 saw what was dubbed by many as Green Day. So this is a day when the UK government published 44 documents, including policy statements, consultation launches, responses to previous consultations, and announcements of external reviews. Together, these ran to almost 300 pages of documents and contained announcements covering almost every area of the UK economy. Of particular note for today are kind of policy announcements detailing kind of ambitions and emissions cuts between 2021 and 2023. So the largest emission cuts outlined in kind of Green Day announcements, around 58 million tonnes of carbon emissions reductions, are expected to come from the transportation sector, and that's principally through a shift towards electric vehicles. But industry comes a close second with around 54 million tonnes of expected emissions reductions. And that comes through the use of carbon capture and storage, but also importantly, a shift from the use of fossil fuels to electrification, increasingly powered by renewable energy, and the use of hydrogen and biofuels also seen as key to that reduction. Power generation is expected to deliver around 46 million tonnes of reductions over that period through increased renewables capacity alongside uptake in nuclear and hydrogen energy. And across multiple industries, energy storage is recognised as a crucial factor, playing a key role in kind of energy system flexibility and efficiency, and also in reducing the peak volume size of generating capacity needed to meet demand. And to finish, I think just a reminder of why this is all so pressing. We've heard from John this morning, climate change is an existential crisis. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has repeatedly stressed the economic and environmental and social harm that climate change will present, and particularly inaction on climate change. Just last month, we saw the World Meteorological Organization announce that it is now more likely than not that global temperatures will breach the 1.5 degree threshold in the next 5 years, making extreme weather events such as the wildfires seen here on the screen more likely. So we know the challenge we face, and we know that the urgency that presents. And we know that the solution will not come from one single silver bullet, but from a multitude of steps and positive changes that move us in the right direction. And now to introduce the first of our panel speakers, who will each be explaining how the technology that they're involved in can help to unlock a net zero future. So Catherine Raw is Managing Director at SSE Thermal. Catherine joined SSE in April 22, bringing operational and financial experience from her previous roles as Chief Operating Officer for North America and Chief Financial Officer at the metals and mining group Barrick Gold. Prior to that, Catherine worked at the fund management group BlackRock, and we're delighted that she's joined us today to bring this wealth of experience and specialised knowledge in commodities, natural resources, and investment to our event today. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, Kate. So as you said, I'm MD of SSE Thermal, and I'm responsible for running SSE's fleet of flexible, dispatchable thermal power generation assets. It's gas storage business and responsible for delivering flexible, low carbon thermal energy to achieve net zero, and hence why I'm here to talk to you today. But before I start, I wanted to just flick on to the poll. So given I'm about to talk to you about the exciting world of low carbon flexibility, the question I had to ask is, how much low carbon flexible capacity does the Climate Change Committee report on delivering a reliable decarbonised power system that came out earlier this year say is needed by 2035? And this relates to the government commitment to decarbonise the power system in 2035. Is it 1, up to 5 gigawatts, 2, 7 to 10 gigawatts, or 3, 12 to 20 gigawatts? So as I present, I'll let you mull that one over, and I'll come to it at the end with the conclusion to that question. So I work for SSE PLC, and the company is a microcosm of the UK's energy system as a whole. We're a FTSE 30 company, positioning ourselves as the clean energy champion of UK and Ireland and beyond as we move international. And our strategy is to develop, build, operate, and invest in the electricity infrastructure and businesses needed in the transition to net zero. So our whole purpose, vision, raison d'etre is to deliver net zero for the power system. And when you look at how we're going to do that, it is through investing in the next 5 years over £18 billion, in the next decade up to £40 billion, to accelerate that net transition through renewables, so offshore wind, onshore wind and solar, through hydro and pump storage, through networks, so that the grid can cope with the significant increase in demand that comes from the electrification of a lot of current energy uses, as well as the intermittent renewable load that is coming onto the system over this next period. And then the third leg to that stool is the business that I run, SSE Thermal, which is providing low carbon, flexible, dispatchable generation, power generation at scale. And essentially this underpins a renewables-led system. It provides that backup capacity when the wind isn't blowing or when the sun isn't shining. So if you think about the last 18 months, we had lower than normal wind. We had periods of, weeks-long stillness over the winter. We have periods of variable demand. So during the day, you'll see peak demand coming through at about 6:30 in the evening. And so that ability to be able to switch power on and off at scale is incredibly important, and ultimately a service and a necessary requirement of a stable, low carbon power system. So when you then look at exactly what that flexibility looks like, there is a role for the current fleet. And so, the previous 18 months, as I've said, the importance of our existing fleet in balancing the market, the big challenges over the last 12, 18 months were around low French nuclear power. So we had significant outages last summer that led to the European markets being incredibly tight, and then coupling that with the Ukraine crisis and a lack of gas coming to the system. And then, of course, the drought over the summer, meaning that, in Germany, they weren't able to barge coal to the coal power stations. What we saw was an incredibly tight market, a low wind environment during periods of that. And so it was these gas power stations, our existing fleet of gas power stations, that was able to respond. Our gas storage assets, so this is salt cavern storage up in Aldborough and Attic, that were able to really be able to balance the system. And so that role is going to be equally necessary when we look at the future and we look at the way in which we're going to balance a renewables-led system, an increasingly intermittent system, and periods where that intermittency can actually last for a long time. What it tells us is that the market's going to get more volatile, and therefore the ability to have assets that can respond to that volatility and respond to that imbalance is going to become important. Aside from the CCC report that I referenced earlier in the polling question, there are other signals that this type of flexibility is going to be incredibly important. Whether it's recent capacity market auctions, the tool the government uses to ensure security supply, what we've seen is the need for more volume to be procured over time. And so when we go to 2035, the CCC says around 2% of flexible generation will still be coming from unabated gas. What they see is the remainder is coming from enormous amounts, significant volumes of low carbon flexible capacity. And it assumes that by 2035, the critical infrastructure that needs to be built in order to do that will have been built to do so. And as a result, one of the comments they make is that the government must give equal focus to low carbon flexible solutions as to the full delivery of its existing renewables and nuclear commitments. This is vital to ensuring the future variable renewable dominated electricity system is reliable and resilient to potential future weather extremes. And so the two technologies that SSE Thermal are really driving when we talk about low carbon flexibility at scale are carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. So carbon capture and storage, which I won't go into too much detail here, I'll focus on what we're doing on hydrogen. But carbon capture and storage is taking natural gas fired power stations, and then post combustion, it's capturing the flue gases, the off gases, removing the CO2, piping that CO2 then to a subsea store, either a saline aquifer or a depleted gas field, where it then effectively is stored and ultimately lithifies and is arguably permanently stored into the Earth's crust. So that's carbon capture. It is still potentially using fossil fuels. So alternative is hydrogen, which is a pre-combustion technology. So that is through burning low carbon hydrogen. And there are two ways of producing that hydrogen. One that would be described as low carbon. The first is blue hydrogen, and that is through a reformer that effectively cracks natural gas to produce hydrogen and CO2. And then that same CO2 pipeline that is used for power, CCS, takes that CO2 and puts that into the carbon store. And the hydrogen is used potentially then for power or for other industrial uses. And then the other form of hydrogen is green hydrogen, which is produced through electrolyzers, where effectively you're breaking up water to its constituent parts, hydrogen and oxygen, and that can be the electricity in order to power that electrolyzer can be made from renewable energy. One of the uses of that green hydrogen can be power. Now, one of the big debates is, can that be economic? Because ultimately, if you're using electricity to make hydrogen as an energy store, to then burn it to make electricity again, is that the most efficient and best use of hydrogen? And so these are critical questions that ultimately we need to answer in order to define what can be the appropriate technology to supply large, scalable, green, flexible energy over time. And so from SSE Thermal's perspective, we are agnostic on technology, and hence why we're looking at multiple different technologies. And I would say we're also including HVO, so hydrotreated vegetable oils, in terms of some of the other technologies that we're looking at, or fuels that we're looking at, in order to ultimately provide multiple solutions to the same problem, which is how do you supply flexible, dispatchable power at scale when the system needs it. So just quickly moving on, when you look at where to deploy these technologies, the obvious place is in the UK's industrial heartlands. There are clear synergies here with the need to decarbonize industry, as well as other technologies that can also benefit from the same infrastructure. So whether it's hydrogen and the necessary hydrogen pipelines, or whether it's CCS and taking that CO2 from industry as well as power. And what we've just put here is where SSE's existing operations are. And what you can see is that our locations of our existing power stations are not coincidentally located within these industrial clusters, and therefore well located, and our existing networks, our existing relationships, and our existing assets. In the case of Kidby, where we have Kidby 3 carbon capture and storage planned, we also have Kidby hydrogen power, 100% hydrogen CCGT planned, as well as our Aldborough and Attic salt caverns, where we are looking to convert an Aldborough cavern, a salt cavern at Aldborough, and potentially to develop 9 new caverns over time to be able to store hydrogen, to therefore supply the Humber region, which is the largest emitter in the UK. And so just going into that in a little more detail to talk about those projects. So the Aldborough Hydrogen Pathfinder is probably our most advanced stage project in the hydrogen space. So this is located at Aldborough, our existing gas storage assets. You can just see that at the top of the page. It sits 15 kilometers north of Saltend, where you have Equinor planning to produce blue hydrogen through H2H Saltend, where we have a joint venture with Equinor at Saltend, which is owned by Triton Power, where we're looking to blend hydrogen into that power station. You can see Kidby our existing assets, Kidby 1 and 2 CCGTs, but also then Kidby carbon capture and Kidby hydrogen. So the purpose of this is to create ecosystems for hydrogen. You have to establish the infrastructure in order for people to use hydrogen. You need production, you need storage, and you need offtake. And so what's unique about the Aldborough Hydrogen Pathfinder project, it is doing all three in one location, and it can begin to prove whether or not hydrogen to power, green hydrogen to power, is a solution for the future. And what it's looking to do is a 35 megawatt Siemens Energy electrolyzer, converting one of the existing gas caverns to hydrogen, and then putting in a 50 megawatt OCGT, Siemens Energy OCGT, to fire at 100% hydrogen. So you're proving the technologies. So a 35 megawatt electrolyzer is quite a significant scale relative to what the UK is used to. You're proving the ability to store in a salt cavern. And what you're also proving is whether or not you can produce hydrogen when electricity prices are low, when renewables is plentiful, and you can burn hydrogen and sell that power when electricity is expensive, at peak demand, in volatile periods. And that is where you overcome the inefficiency of using electricity to make hydrogen to then burn it again. And that's called load shifting. And it's fundamentally important as to whether or not hydrogen is going to be useful to the future of low carbon flexible thermal energy. Now, I'm very cognizant I've gone over time, so I'll leave it there. What I will just do is go back to the poll. And in fact, you were all absolutely right. So the answer to the polling question was that we need 12 to 20 gigawatts of low carbon flexible power, which can be either CCS or hydrogen. And you were right with 65.2% of you getting the correct answer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Some really great insights there. I'm sure a few points that will spark debate and questions from our audience. And just a reminder to the audience, you can submit questions throughout the event via the engagement panel. We will be taking as many as possible of those during the Q&A session. But to our next speaker, and we will be joined by David Bryon, who's Chief Financial Officer at First Light Fusion. So following a career in both large corporates and small and medium-sized enterprises, David's held CFO and CEO roles at a number of Oxford University spin-outs. He's also run a consultancy, Right Brain Finance, that supports technology startups as they look to raise money and grow their businesses. First Light Fusion was one of those clients, and David joined the board in 2015 to support the business across all non-technical aspects of their operations, from fundraising to challenges of scaling up the business. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Hi. Yeah. So in contrast to Catherine's solutions to the now, let's talk about the future. So I want to talk to you about. Hang on, where's my slide? Yeah. So I want to talk to you about why the world needs a clean baseload power supply, why fusion can meet this need, and give you 5 reasons why I believe First Light's unique amplifying targets could be the technology that delivers this. Simplicity is a golden thread that runs through what we do at First Light. Fusion power by the simplest machine possible. Simple is cost effective, simple is deployable. As simple as possible is a way to make fusion power work. First Light is Oxford University's fusion energy spin-out. We have a fabulously talented team. We have built world-class shock physics and diagnostic capabilities. And just over a year ago, we demonstrated our amplifier-enabled targets, a totally new concept in fusion, do generate fusion. And most importantly, we write and run simulation codes that uniquely in the field simulate every aspect of what we do, allowing us to use best-in-class machine learning to optimize our designs and systems. In a field that takes decades to make progress, this allows us to move with speed and agility. And here's our fusion, inertial fusion concept in the simplest diagram possible. We launch a projectile at hypervelocities. This projectile delivers kinetic energy to our amplifier, which takes the incoming shock wave, rapidly collapses a fuel capsule and creates conditions necessary for fusion. But what is fusion? The universe's energy comes from fusion, as light elements are joined together to create heavier elements, releasing energy in exchange for mass. Many elements can be fused, but the easiest reaction is deuterium and tritium, both of which are isotopes of hydrogen. Of all the fuels, these require the lowest temperature and give the highest energy yield. Fusion fuel has the highest energy density of any fuel. A cup of water contains enough deuterium to power my home for over a year. So why is this important? To decarbonize, we need to electrify. This process is already happening. It's moving fast, but it needs to accelerate, and it needs to be powered with clean energy. So what should we do? We should be deploying as much wind, solar, geothermal storage as much as we can, as quickly as we can. But is this the whole solution? We don't think so. Intermittent technologies have got limitations in deployment rates and cost. We think by 2050, there will be a clean energy gap. If we rely wholly on existing technology, carbon fuels will endure and fill that gap. We don't think this should be allowed to happen. We need a clean baseload power, and the obvious choices for this are fission, traditional nuclear, or fusion. Fission has problems in history. Because of this, it is expensive and hard to build. Fusion doesn't have these problems, technical or social. You can't get meltdowns. It's intrinsically safe. You don't get the long-lived, centuries-long waste issues, and you don't have a dirty weapons problem. It can be built. So we think fusion can work and will deliver baseload power to fill this clean energy gap. And I'm about to present to you 5 reasons why I think First Light will be the company to do this. So my first reason, the core physics of inertial fusion have been proven. Back in December 2022, the National Ignition Facility, NIF, in California, USA, demonstrated target gain via inertial fusion. They got more energy out of their targets than they put in. We now know which fuel capsules work. We know that inertial fusion works. But the NIF research does not lend itself to a reactor. It's too expensive, it's too complicated. However, we can put to use all that is good in NIF and turn it into a functioning power plant technology. How? I hear you ask. We use our unique amplifier technology as a wrapper around their fuel capsule. Our amplifiers do 2 things. They amplify velocity, taking an input velocity and creating an output velocity many times higher. This works. There we go. They also create convergence. They wrap the shock waves around the fuel capsule, creating a spherical collapse, just like what happens at a National Ignition Facility, but crucially with a shock wave that comes from only one side. This massively simplifies the engineering and allows us to bypass the main engineering challenges of fusion. There's an efficiency cost to amplification. Nothing comes for free. But we overcome this with a cheap source of energy, the spark plug for this reaction. And this is my third reason. So pulse power is that source of cheap energy. We could use a laser to drive the shock wave, much like happens at NIF. However, pulse power is 3 orders of magnitude cheaper than a laser of a similar delivered energy, and it is much easier to build. This is fusion by the simplest machine possible. And the amplifier allows one-sided drive of the shock wave, and this is crucial as it unlocks a simplified engineering concept that bypasses the engineering challenges of fusion. By using a liquid metal wall like a shower curtain, we protect the key components of the plant from the damaging neutrons. We also manage the heat flux, and critically, we have enough surface area exposed to the neutrons to produce the tritium needed for generating half of the fuel we need. This is 3 challenges solved by 1 solution. Others need to solve these challenges with this system. We don't have to. This is a power plant that can be built mainly with existing technology. And the final piece of the puzzle is the business model. How do you capture sufficient value to justify the investment required to make this work? We shall manufacture and supply the targets. Now, this is a low capex, high value, high margin opportunity, and it addresses the $1.6 trillion annual recurring market. We think this can create a very valuable company. And much like Nespresso, we won't be building the machines that use our targets. We want maximum scalability, and working with partners enables us to deliver this. Using existing technologies or adjacent technologies, existing supply chains can deploy these reactors, the drivers, the fusion islands, the balance of plant. The companies that build power plants today can build our power plants tomorrow. So as this is talking physics, I have to leave you with one simple equation. Adding together proven target physics, wrapping it in first light fusion's amplifier technology, powering it with a cheap energy source, simplifying the engineering, and delivering this with a scalable business model, you will then begin to understand why I think First Light's inertial fusion technology is coming and can help us in this energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Always fascinating to hear about such an emerging area of technology. And as a maths graduate myself, I love an equation in there. So thank you for that. Now to introduce our next speaker. So next up is John Flaherty, Managing Director of Grid Scale Energy Solutions at SMS plc. Within the energy industry, John's experience spans senior roles within conglomerates and startups across finance, consumer service and commercial areas, with a focus on energy innovation. Over to you, John.
So I run the part of SMS that builds, operates and trades grid scale energy storage sites. So we're talking, 50 megawatts plus, relatively large. And I'm going to focus on two key themes. And one of them, I think actually everyone so far has been talking about, which is there is no single solution to the problem. But I was going to take it down a level and talk about how there is no single solution within battery storage, even. And then I was going to touch on the ancillary needs of networks and how batteries fulfill those relatively uniquely. So a quick poll. So I'd like you just to give me your view of what proportion of National Grid's forecast requirement of storage will be grid scale battery storage by the year 2050. So is it going to be around about a quarter, roughly 50%, roughly 75%, or something nearing 100%? I'll come back to that in a moment. So front of meter or behind the meter. So obviously I spend my time behind the meter building large battery plants. I obviously think they're amazing. You can get scale quickly. They can do most activities, and they really do help bridge a lot of gaps between services that keep the network running smoothly and stopping either instances where there is too much energy or too little and reacting quickly and being dynamic. But what about behind the meter? So we're talking either a small industrial scale or domestic, a battery on someone's house, maybe complementing a solar system, or a UPS system that's slightly overscaled at an industrial site. It's quite often dismissed as being too complicated, too dispersed, and not really able to generate sufficient scale. But over the winter of 22-23, we saw that through the Demand Flexibility Service, or DFS, that National Grid ran, there is some real possibility of scale through behind the meter solutions. Now, there were issues with the DFS. It was run at levels that weren't genuinely market. It was rather more expensive than the alternatives, whilst at the same time, consumers actually didn't think it was necessarily worth participating in. and yet participation was quite reasonable. I think off the top of my head, there was at least once more than 100 megawatts delivered on a demand, and it made a difference. It actually did suppress other prices in the market at the time, and it showed that this was a route to another solution to help the system. I'm of genuine belief, and SMS as a company is that the real way to drive this and create genuine scale is to make it more benign. So not to have people preparing the day before to turn off their televisions, lights, go to one room and do very low energy consuming activities, but rather have it without the consumer being aware and managing those small batteries and those solar systems and energy consuming devices. And that will drive scale over the next decade. Now, to go back to the poll, so National Grid have been consistently increasing their estimates of what amount of storage is required. Historically, storage was De Norwig and other hydro plants. And as of the end of last year, there was 4.5 gigawatts, of which roughly a third was battery storage, all grid scale. Now, by 2050, we're going to go through a transition where grid scale will be about 3/4 of the storage demand met, dropping to around about 52%. Now, amazingly, 60% of you were correct, with about 25 going for 75%, which, considering that was the 2030 figure, I think the vast majority of you can pat yourselves on the back. But it's absolutely crucial that there is that balance between solutions within storage, because storage is an amazing complementer to everything else that everyone else is talking about. It's a complementer to thermal, nuclear of various types, renewables, etc., helping to just soften the edges. And in that softening of edges thought, just a brief recognition of the non-power or pure power elements of what batteries deliver. So all the things that non-electrical engineers don't realize about power is that things have to be kept in a very defined set of harmonics and other boundaries in order for the system to work. It's not simply I need a watt of power and I get a watt of power and things work. So my analogy for frequency as an example of those other elements that need to be kept in check is, in the past when we had just a completely thermal system and there were lots of large turbines all turning with relative synchronicity, there was a wonderful thing called inertia, and frequency was relatively well controlled. And you could almost think of that as a single pebble in a pond, and you have lovely ripples and everything looks wonderfully under control. If you then move to the system that we have now, which is lots of disparate systems, particularly renewable ones, and solar is the real antagonizer in this, is you end up with disjointed frequency coming from the different generators. Akin to throwing a handful of pebbles into the pond, in which you go from something beautiful to something quite frightening very, very quickly. Now, here is where, amongst a lot of other solutions, batteries play a significant role in helping to turn that back into the wonderful single ripple equivalent, i.e. keeping it as 50 megahertz. Now, I'm going to leave it there. Otherwise, you'll start going down the rabbit holes of reactive power and other things, which, quite honestly, we'd lose the afternoon to. And I'd quite like to listen to your questions later. So I'll hand back over to Kate.
Thank you, John. We do love a good rabbit hole, but hopefully we'll be able to dig a little bit deeper into some of these issues during the Q&A. Now we have a short break now before our next speaker. I think we will reconvene at 1:05. But to give you something to ponder during that break, perhaps while you get a cup of tea, here's another poll question. So according to the International Energy Agency, how much annual investment in clean energy do we need by 2030 to reach net zero? And this is annual investment that will need to be seen. So is that 40 billion, 400 billion, or 4 trillion? And I'll leave you with that and look forward to seeing you all again after the break. Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Kai Johns, an ethical, sustainable and impact researcher in my team at Greenbank. Kai is a CFA charter holder and has developed a specialism within Greenbank on energy and climate, developing frameworks for assessing climate risk and opportunities at both a portfolio and an individual investment level. Kai, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yep, so I'm going to be speaking about investing in net zero and how we go about doing that here at Greenbank. So to start with, on the chart here, I've got the S-curve of innovation. And what it shows is the development of a product's sales over time. And we've divided it up into 3 sections. So on the left-hand side here with investments, you've got the early stages of a product where there are high upfront costs, there's lots of spending in research and development, and sales are relatively flat. And then you have an inflection point, at which point you enter into the growth phase, and the technology starts to take off, and you start to achieve mass adoption. And then finally, as you come to the end of a product's life cycle, you get into the fade phase. So this is where the products might have been replaced by a superior product, or it's reached full market penetration. Now, a lot of what we've been talking about today has been on that left-hand side in the investment phase and sort of starting to move into that inflection point. Now, there are other renewable technologies that we haven't touched on, such as solar and wind, that sit more in the middle phase. And there's an interesting thing that can happen when a product is in that phase called a learning curve or a learning rate. And this is the concept that as units of production and capacity increase, costs per unit can come down. So to give you an example, with lithium-ion batteries over the past couple of decades, each time output has doubled, costs have come down by between 20 and 24%. So another tech that has benefited from those interesting learning rates is solar. And on the chart here, what we have is the IEA's forecasts revised every couple of years for how solar PV has moved up that S-curve. And the one on the left-hand side, the darker blue with the arrowhead, that is what's actually happened. And all these multiple coloured ones are what the forecasts are. And I think the lesson here is that each forecast consistently underestimated the growth and the sharpness of that middle part of the S-curve. Now, what's quite interesting is that this only goes up to 2017. After that, in 2018 and subsequent years, as the technology became more mature, the IEA improved its ability at forecasting. But why is it difficult to forecast in that early stage? Well, predicting that inflection point, that takeoff point, is quite a hard thing to do. And one of the reasons for that is that if you think about the history of transitions, not just in energy, but in agriculture or digital, most recently with AI, the time between each phase is decreasing. And that makes it tricky to work out what's going to happen next. So as investors, what can we do? How can we approach this? So the main thing that we can do is follow the money. And the poll question that we asked was, what level of spending do we need to see globally each year by 2030 to meet net zero, according to the IEA predictions? And the answer was 4 trillion. So 10 times that of what the crowd selected, of 400 billion. And what we have on this chart here is where we're at now and what's happened since 2004. So at the moment, we're about 1.1 trillion. So to reach that 2030 figure, we need to more than treble from where we are now. But if you go back a couple of years to 2019 to 2020, you can see that we've already started to see a real uptick in spend. So are we at the start of that inflection point for global investment in the energy transition? There are a couple of pieces of legislation that would suggest that we are. So the EU has introduced its European Green Deal, and the US has introduced the Inflation Reduction Act. Both of these contain grants and subsidies in the hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 5 to 10 years. The EU goes further and has a sort of a range of loans and financing options available. And the Inflation Reduction Act includes some uncapped tax credits. So the spending could go as high as demand necessitates. So the idea here is that you move these early stage technologies, the likes of which some of we've heard today, into that middle phase, that growth phase, and then start to benefit from those learning rates. As the technologies improve and the unit economics start to make sense on their own, you can start to remove the subsidies. But how at Greenbank do we go from this big level picture, this increase in spending that we've seen, the range of solutions we've had on display so far, and translated into the company level, into the client portfolio level? Well, I think the main thing to say is that no single measure can do that for you. And there are a lot of measures out there, as you can see on the chart. So how we think about it is at Greenbank, we've created a climate framework for integration, and we really break it down into 4 key areas. The first is opportunity. So what is the total addressable market of this product or solution? What's the customer demand? And what are the possible learning rates that technology might see? The second is positive impact. So how is this company helping the world to decarbonize? What level of avoided emissions is this company delivering, or could this company deliver? Third, we have costs, and we think of costs in a couple of ways. So one of them is the cost to decarbonize. So what will this company have to spend to electrify its current processes, power it by renewables, and complete its journey to a net zero company? Now, the other way we think of costs is that of physical risk. Is the company exposed to a high risk of flooding, of extreme heat, of extreme cold? What are the costs associated with either abating those risks or moving your sites or locations or factories? And then finally, we think in terms of operational alignment, and this is key. And this is the question of whether the company has a viable net zero business model, whether it has a plan to get there, and whether we believe it can deliver on that plan. So here we're looking at a range of factors, including capital spending alignment, its targets and disclosures, and its overall decarbonisation strategy. So that's how we combine the big picture thinking that we started with on the spending and the global increase in energy transition spend with the micro level with the company. And on that, I will hand back to you, Kate.
Thank you, Kai. And I'd like now just to invite all of our panelists back to the virtual stage for our panel discussion. Please do continue to submit questions via the engagement panel on the right of your screen. We'll do our best to address as many of those as possible in the subsequent discussion. And one perhaps to kick us off. So It appears that many of the solutions to climate change are known, but there are still significant barriers in implementing them at the scale that is necessary to address the challenge we face. So just a question to each of our panelists of what would be on your wish list to help remove those barriers and accelerate progress towards net zero. And David, I will start with you.
Sure. Okay. What will accelerate? Yeah, wish list. Okay. So I think we have we have some major kind of political problems, don't we? Don't we here? I think it's climate change has been politicized. It needs to be depoliticized. It needs to be understood this affects things whether you're on the left or the right of the political spectrum. I think that would help significantly in getting our understanding of the world and our facts aligned. I also think climate change is a collective action problem as well, and we don't have enough supranational bodies really to tackle this. So that'd be amazing if the world could fix that. I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen. So, but I suppose in things that are in our perhaps more in our gift, I think in the UK certainly we need something equivalent to the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the UK's going to be hurt by this in the long run unless the government responds on that. And I suppose kind of extending that concept, things that would incentivize investment into here within such a such a framework would be hugely beneficial. Would be beneficial certainly to first light fusion in our mission, because this is quite an expensive endeavor trying to demonstrate fusion energy and then develop that into power plants, and certainly for all the other technologies that will be required as well, because there's no one solution here. We need lots and lots of things in play to make this work.
Yeah, I think that's the one takeaway message from today, isn't it? Of we need that ecosystem of solutions in order to tackle this complex problem. Catherine, perhaps I could turn to you and just ask what's on your wish list.
Well, I suppose it's a subset of what Dave just went through, and I've written it down: policy, legislation, and pace. What the UK has been quite good at is setting out an ambition and setting out a framework. So in terms of legally binding commitments, in terms of decarbonisation of the power system by 2035, in terms of 10 gigawatts of hydrogen production targeted by 2030, of which at least 5 is green, therefore default the other 5 is blue. So they've got these very high level measures. What they don't then have is the level below, which is the specific policies, passing the energy bill, and then the pace of the funding mechanisms and the sheer complexity of all the funding mechanisms that you go through. So a good example, our Aldborough Hydrogen Pathfinder is part of the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund Strand 3, in which we submitted last October. We've been shortlisted to one of 20. We've now got to wait for a few months, and then we may or may not get it. And if we don't get it, then what? Do we then, go back round again and start? It's very linear in terms of the way it's moving. And if you want that flywheel to turn, you need to actually be moving all of these things in parallel so you can accelerate as fast as possible all of these technologies, all of these things. But the one thing I would say is we did get a £20 billion commitment in the Powering Up Britain to CCS, and that infrastructure, that CO2 infrastructure, then starts to set up a hydrogen economy and starts to set up the industrialization of both the East Coast cluster and the HyNet cluster, either side of the UK. So steps are being taken, but like I say, it's just not fast enough, and it's not simple and structured enough.
Yeah, thank you. And John.
So they're the big items, and if I was to hone in on one small bit that then prevents anything happening, is a lack of skills. There simply aren't enough trained people, be them medium or high voltage electrical engineers, domestic level installers to increase efficiency or put domestic solutions in place. Across the board, we have a real shortage of people with the required skills, and if we don't start training them and have a serious plan to train and upskill people, we could have done everything else, and then we'd still find that we were on pause.
Yes, I think that speaks to the complexity of the issue, isn't it? When you think it's not just climate change and all the challenges that presents, but all the other kind of aspects of sustainable development as well, and ensuring we don't lose sight of those kind of social risks and opportunities alongside the environmental ones. Another question that's come in, and particularly for David. So what are your expectations for the timeline of deployment of nuclear fusion? And is there a danger, if that timeline's delayed, that it ceases to be viable if we look at it as a solution to net zero?
Okay, so yeah, Helion announced a rather aggressive and somewhat probably implausible timeline for their first electrons on the grid with an associated marketing or sales agreement to Microsoft. So that's kind of like maybe set some unrealistic expectations on this. We're saying early 2030s. We think we can have a pilot plant up and running. Clearly, that doesn't help towards the 2030 goal. It does help massively towards the 2050 goal. And back to your graph that you showed before with the, how are we going to power the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere? I think fusion could play a huge part in that as well. So yeah, I think even if fusion arrives mid 2030s, and it will. There's so many companies now we have with aggressive timelines. Look, especially across the pond with the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act, and some of our competitors across there, they are pushing really hard to get these solutions out there. So I think don't expect it 2028 unless Helion have some kind of like special thing that the rest of us just aren't unaware of that could enable them to deliver on this. And of course, Sam Altman is very good buddies with the rest of Microsoft with his OpenAI stuff as well. So I think it's divorce the marketing from the reality of it. I think early 2030s, and it will play a major part.
Thank you. And I think it's again one of those kind of buzz phrases of this is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good with this, and not all solutions need to arrive tomorrow, as long as they do continue to kind of help us accelerate in the right direction. Another thing that's been picked up in some of the questions, and several of you have spoken about this, is around that kind of ecosystem of solutions that are needed, and fostering kind of collaboration and innovation between different businesses. And I wonder, perhaps, Catherine, if you can talk a little bit more about SSE's experience in drawing together some of those coalitions in the kind of developing your low carbon hubs.
Sure. So one of the benefits or positives, I suppose, of the way the government decided to approach decarbonisation of industrial clusters was essentially to identify industrial clusters and go out to industry and say, okay, come to us with a CO2 store, a transport and storage network, and then emitters. And you work it out, and then we'll subsidise it. And what that has forced is, normally cutthroat competitors that never share information and never want to talk to one another are now actually looking to, all get to the final goal. So what we've seen, as part of that, we formed a joint venture with Equinor to develop KIDB 3 in the East Coast cluster, to develop Peterhead carbon capture up in the Scottish cluster, to look at Aldbrough hydrogen storage. We're moving on the Pathfinder ourselves at the moment, just to prove that to power. But in terms of just establishing, okay, who are the players, where are you aligned, and where is your infrastructure, what's the word, complementary? It's been very positive in that. And I think increasingly so. What we're seeing as a government, or not so much the government, but the civil servants, who are incredibly stretched, are dealing with something they've never done before. And actually, it's up to industry to try and get away from its, bias and self-interest, and start to be offering solutions. And by coming together as group, coming together as industry bodies, whether it's Energy UK or Underground Energy Storage Association or all of these other different bodies, and speaking with a single voice and helping them come to policy decisions. It has, we hope that it creates momentum and accelerates pace.
Yes, I think that's a really important point to draw out, isn't it? It's that intersection of kind of public policy action and private investment and action as well.
One thing I should just add, it also de-risks these first of a kind technologies. So if I think about me going to my GC and saying, I want to invest X 100 million up to billions into some of these projects, being able to have a 50% partner help de-risk that just means that you're able to do more faster. So the other benefit of partnerships throughout this and aligning with other industry players is the de-risking of these first of a kind technologies.
Absolutely, yes, and that's key to kind of unlocking private capital flows into low carbon future as well, is that certainty and the clear view of risks and opportunities. And I think so one question that's come in that's more kind of directed for home team, Greenbank, is around the 4 areas that Kai talked through and how we balance those in terms of identifying the best opportunities for investment portfolios. So for example, if a company presented a fantastic opportunity to decarbonize the economy, but its operational alignment was weak, would we consider those equally? So I'll use kind of chair's prerogative just to respond to that one. And I'd say within Greenbank, we're looking at these organisations holistically. So we're considering where they are now and the positive and negative impacts that they present. We're looking at their potential trajectory across a range of sustainability factors and whether that is positive or negative, looking at the commitments that have been made, whether those are long-term ambitions, kind of long-term alone or backed up by short and medium-term targets as well, looking at whether that is backed by capital expenditure plans and the business strategy. And if we think about those companies that perhaps aren't quite there yet, but we do feel there'll be a credible pathway towards them becoming net zero aligned, it's about how effective our engagement can be. So looking at what would be the measures that company would need to take to move from where it is now to being net zero aligned. And then through our engagement and our dialogue with those companies, kind of taking a judgment as to how we think their philosophy aligns. So do they take this issue seriously? Are they perhaps doing more than they've yet publicly declared, but those commitments are in train? Or do we think actually it's an organisation that doesn't think about this strategically enough? And all of that will inform our assessment of a company from a climate risk and opportunity point of view. And of course, all of those factors are constantly changing and updating as we assess the most recent information we have available to us. But back out to the panel. So lots and lots of questions coming in now. So one which I think is quite an interesting thing to pick up on is, given the kind of complexities and uncertainties of some of these newer energy technologies, wouldn't it be better and fairer and easier and admittedly cheaper to focus on energy reductions and the demand side first before we look to the supply side? So I don't know if anyone in particular would like to pick that point up, else I'll volunteer you.
It's an and, isn't it? You did an and come up with supply side. I don't think it's an or question here.
Absolutely agree. And I think if we look at the International Energy Agency projections, we do see, I think it's something like an 8% reduction in overall energy supply through to 2050 from today's figures, but meeting a much larger economy and a growing world population. So even though the kind of the balance of technologies supplying that energy will change, we do see the real need to drive down overall energy use. One that's just come in, so will the grid be able to keep up with the level of ambition for the deployment of these technologies required to meet our net zero goals? And perhaps, John, that's one that you would like to pick up on.
Yeah, and there may be some follow-up, I suspect, but I'll give my 2 penneth. So it's a mix. So we've recently had some very positive news from the network about how they're going to analyze the effect of batteries on the network when they're connected. So instead of believing they're going to work in both directions permanently 24/7 and ruin everything, they're actually determining them as zero impact, because actually they should be operating complementary to the issues. Now that'll really help get batteries onto the network. Now, conversely, that should then have some beneficial impact on aiding the queues of other renewable generation being able to join, because the queues will naturally now be shorter, and there will also be more mitigating storage to help balance the issues. It doesn't solve the problem, but it's positive. In terms of EVs, it is a very local problem, and it's down at the sort of 11 kV network where the issue is, and there's no limit to the demand for people to put chargers in. The issue is mostly that the network is just really jammed at the bottom, on the ends of the fingers, if you like. It's the DNOs don't really know how to cope with the growth in charging and the how to manage all those vehicles when they turn up. So a combination of software management, investment in the network at that point, as well as dramatic investment at the top of the network as well. But look, there are some positives. I'll leave it there. Someone else may have an opinion on other elements, but yeah, there are some positives.
Well, maybe I can step in. So as part of SSE, although we're a separated business, we obviously have a networks business. And so we are in both transmission and distribution. And so we see this challenge. So first of all, there are major programs, whether it's transmission and National Grid's holistic network design and ASTI programs. So there are huge investments that are going to be made over the next decade. But the challenge is it enough? When you look at Scotland putting out further offshore wind targets, you're going to need to do even more. And then to John's point on the distribution end, you need to be making anticipatory investments rather than reactive ones. And we're not there yet, I don't think. And then finally, the big challenge you're also seeing for grid is connections. And you're going to need to reform connections. And so there's consultations going on now, at the moment, in terms of the queues of how much generation, be it battery, wind, solar, is sitting there. We've got far more renewables wanting to connect than any target that we've got, and not all of those projects are real. And so how do you start to filter between the real solid projects and what the dross, I suppose, and the current system isn't set up for that, and it needs to be reformed as a result. So there's a lot that needs to happen, and it's in the press at the moment, and everyone's, the government's going to blame Ofgem, and Ofgem's going to blame Grid, and Grid's going to blame the DNOs, and the DNOs are going to, do you know what I mean? It's going to go round in circles, but something will happen, I think.
Absolutely, thank you. Another kind of theme that's coming out in the questions is around kind of public perception of some of these technologies and perhaps misconceptions around the safety of technologies such as hydrogen and nuclear. And Catherine and David, I wonder if you can kind of pick up on that and kind of what needs to happen to overcome some of those fears. Are they valid? Are they misplaced? And do they present barriers to wider adoption of some of these technologies?
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, strange, isn't it? We've all been driven around with like petrol in our tanks and don't think that's unconcerning. It's pretty blooming flammable. Yeah, hydrogen is more leaky. I think that's the problem with hydrogen. It's quite hard to keep it in one place. I watched a video about Toyota's latest one, where they've got an armored fuel tank for their latest hydrogen powered car. So I know there are solutions out there. I think it's just managing the health and safety of things is important, but these days we're very good at that. And for sure, I think it is. Back to my earlier point, I think a lot of this is fueled by the kind of the politics and this kind of resistance to change thing as well. And we need to address that. I think we just need to understand, that and I think it will become more and more evident as wildfires rage in Canada that we have an issue. We have an issue. We have to make these changes. And I think a lot of people don't like change. I think maybe that's what it comes down to. They like the existing status quo. They like their lives as they are, and we're going to have to make changes to deal with the problem. Otherwise, those changes are going to punch us in the face. So it's there are most technologies have issues. I referred back to I talked about the problems with fission with traditional nuclear. Really, we should be building nuclear power plants, but we won't, because there's an existential threat from them. If you get meltdown, it's just terrifying. You know, we've got concerns now in Ukraine with the dam going and what might happen to their power plant next. Clearly, fusion tackles these kind of things, but it's a technology that's still got some way to go. If we were good and could manage the risks better in fission, would have built a whole fleet of those, and this may have been a solved problem, but it's not, and it won't be in the short term. So yeah, public perception is just a very difficult thing to manage.
But just on hydrogen, I think one of the ways of managing it are to start with industry rather than domestic. So that's one of the discussions go. So there's a big debate on hydrogen for heating, and should you have hydrogen-fired boilers, and should national gas transmission be converting, redundant gas pipes to hydrogen pipes, etc., etc. And I actually don't want to have an opinion on that, because we're not in the heating world, or at least not yet. But I think actually what you need to do is start to get people familiar with hydrogen, and start small. So a cavern here for storage on existing cavern sites like ours, which are high coma sites, which is a sort of health and safety term, so that we are used to managing that risk, that process safety risk, and how you deal with combustible fuels. Remember, there's an enormous amount of hydrogen being used already in industry, but it's grey hydrogen. So it's effectively blue hydrogen, not capturing the CO2. So this already happens in these industrial locations, and people have never commented on it being next door to them. So it is something that just needs to be desensitized. And I think the obvious way of doing that is to start where the biggest emitters are. And that is on the industrial side, and in areas where we're managing that risk already, and we're able to handle that risk, and we're able to work with the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, and put in the regulations that are necessary, because they all exist already for grey hydrogen.
Thank you. And perhaps just one final question, if I can, to the entire panel, because it can be really, really easy to leave discussions around climate change feeling a little bit kind of hopeless and disenfranchised. So if in kind of 30 seconds you could sum up your note for optimism, or your reason to be cheerful that we can leave people with today. And John, perhaps I will start with you.
I was going to mention the some of the positive news on the networks, but I've already used that one, so I'll do something different. I think it's abundantly clear that money can't wait to throw itself at these projects, transitional technologies, everything else. It's absolutely desperate to get in there, and that means that if we can just polish a few of the other areas and make things happen and get skills right, then there is going to be enough juice behind it to make serious things happen as quickly as they can.
Thank you. Dave, perhaps you next.
Sure. I think let's not underestimate our capacity for innovation. There's some amazing things happening out there, albeit that there's simple things we need to do. There's complicated things coming along, which could also be massively help. But it's also I think the energy crisis of last year demonstrated how quickly we can move when we appreciate there's a crisis. The Germany, they built an LNG terminal in, was it 12 months or something crazy? These things can be done when the motivation is there, and the events dictate. So once we start to get a grip on what's happening, and more consensus is there that it is happening, things could move a lot faster.
Thank you. And Catherine?
Actually, the picture you've got up on screen is quite opportune. That is the flywheel. So I think the flywheel has started to turn. So whether it's the Powering Up Britain comments, whether it's the IRA, whether it's Europe, there's policy and subsidy and decisions albeit too slow, at least they're starting to be made. And what I would hope is as that wheel starts to turn faster and faster and faster, it starts to be self-reinforcing. So for me, the pace is slow now, but if we can pick up that pace, we go to the growth curve that you showed earlier, we'll then enter this very steep period of acceleration. And that's really exciting to be part of.
Thank you. Hopefully a few notes of optimism to leave you all on. So before I just hand back to John to close the proceedings, would like to say a very big thank you to all of our speakers for your fascinating presentations, lively debate in the Q&A. But now over to John to close today's event.
Thank you very much, Kate. So just thinking back to my introduction, I noted that today was not intended to give a full sense that everything is on track to achieve global net zero goals. And our speakers have been very clear on this. They're good to end with a note of optimism. And we've certainly seen today that the tools and technologies necessary to transform our energy system are developing at pace. It's not often that I get to quote Plato at work or at home for that matter, but his proverbial saying that necessity is the mother of invention seems particularly apt today. And encouragingly, as we've heard from Catherine and John, we are already seeing some of that game-changing technology in action. And there is much more to come, as we've heard from David. The glass of water on my desk has taken on a whole new status. The ask is enormous. To achieve net zero by 2050 and limit warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. To get there, the greenhouse gas emissions must nearly halve by 2030. Ambitious targets must be backed by a clear decarbonisation strategy, and transformational policy at a local, national and global level is essential. As we heard from Kate, credible policies are in place to start to make a meaningful step on this journey, but much more is needed. Investors have a key role to play. Huge amounts of capital, $4 trillion quoted per year by 2030, are needed to finance the transition. And we heard from Kai about Greenbank's position at the vanguard of the shift in investor activity to ensure that capital is deployed or redeployed to support the net zero transition and achieve global climate goals. At Greenbank, we are wholly committed to decarbonising our portfolios and are leading from the front with our 2040 net zero target for our investments. If you would like to learn more about our investment proposition, do please contact the team and we'd be delighted to talk further. In conclusion, to follow on Kate, I would like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers, Catherine, David, John, Kai, and of course, Kate, our chair, and to all of you listening and taking the time to join us. The recording of today's Investor Day will be available to view on demand and will be posted on our website over the next few days. Do please share it. A write-up of the event will be available on our website and sent out online in hard copy in September. Do take the time to look at our website, rathbonegreenbank.com, to explore our many other areas of focus, ranging from human rights to biodiversity, to food policy, health and nutrition, and much, much more besides. We'd be very grateful if you could take a couple of minutes to complete the feedback form. The link is on the engagement pane. And finally, and most importantly, thank you all once again for joining our day today. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon and the sunshine. Many thanks.